Well, thank you very much. I'd like to extend my personal appreciation to Dr. Manning and to my friend Marty Morgan for bringing me out here today and allowing me this opportunity to be with you all. Evidently, my reputation precedes me. 3/4 of you left. Am I missing a free meal? Actually, a friend of mine once told me the best way to give a public talk is to have a great opening, a great ending, and try to get the two of them as close together as possible. So we're going to actually try to do that because I want to keep Dr. Manning's schedule on schedule today. And what I wanted to talk to you about is kind of basic. I have no sleight of hand tricks, no 3D, no PowerPoint. I'm hoping to learn PowerPoint before the end of the century. And I just want to talk to you about the guns. We often hear, one of the first things I heard about the Battle of New Orleans was how lopsided the victory was. The 2,000 casualties on the British side to 8 on the American side, or 7. And I'm thinking, how in the world did that happen? And of course, I've had a lifelong interest in firearms. And that goes back to a day when I was 5 years old. My grandmother is from St. Bernard Parish, right here in New Orleans. And she returned home with a folder of documents tracing our family genealogy all the way back to the first Governor General of the province of Louisiana, so that she could join the Colonial Dames Society. She told me, I said, "Are we related to anyone important or famous?" She said, "Well, of course, General Beauregard is my uncle." And I thought, well, that's wonderful. And from that moment on, I was fixated with an interest in firearms of the 19th century. Now, the ones that were used during the War of 1812, and in particular the Battle of New Orleans, didn't really differ a great deal from those that had been used during the American Revolution some 25, 30 years, 40 years before. The elements were still the same. We were looking at firearms that had basically 3 principles to them. The primer, which makes the gun go bang. The propellant, which is the bang part of the gun. And the projectile, the 3 Ps, the primer, the propellant, the projectile. The projectile has been the same pretty much since the dawn of firearms. A lead bullet, a round lead ball in the case of the War of 1812. The propellant has been the same since the Chinese developed it back in the early 600s or so, and that's black powder, the same propellant we still use today in fireworks and things of that nature. The primer is what man had tried to fashion a handle on since the very dawn of firearms invention back in 1350 or so. And that was how to get that propellant to go off. How do you get gunpowder, black powder, to spark, have rapid expansion of gases that will force a projectile down a barrel and onto a target. And from the beginning, they wrestled with that concept. By the American Revolution, the mid-1700s, early 1700s, they had settled on a French design called the flintlock, where basically you have a hammer with a vice type apparatus holding a piece of flint in its jaws. And then a frizzen pan, which is, as you can see in the examples out in the hallway, a large steel pan that's in front of the hammer. And when the hammer hits that, the flint strikes the steel turns red hot, a little bit of that red hot steel drops into the frizzen pan where your priming powder is located, and that goes off, creating a flash in the pan, we've heard. And then that flash in the pan ignites the main charge in the breech, sending your projectile on down range. So that's pretty much how firearms worked throughout the 17th, 18th, and early 19th century. We didn't really change any of those factors until about the 1840s, when we came out with percussion caps, which replaced flint and steel. And in the 1880s, when we replaced black powder with smokeless powder, which allows us to have real neat toys like machine guns that don't foul up. Because black powder, this ancient substance that was discovered by the Chinese, when it goes off, it leaves a thick residue of what we call fouling. in the barrel of the gun. And over a period of time, that fouling will collect. And it makes it very difficult after a long period of time to fire subsequent rounds, because all of your bullets are being loaded at this point in history from the muzzle of the gun. So you place the gun in front of you, you take your cartridge, you bite it off, you drop the powder down, you push the ball into the muzzle, you draw a ramrod, and you ram that home. Then you pull out the ramrod, return it to its keeper underneath the barrel, cock the gun, prime the frizzen pan with some other powder, collapse that, cock the gun, aim it, and fire. An infantryman was taught to do that with accuracy 3 to 4 times a minute. Once every 15 to 20 seconds or so was the average that a soldier, both the American and the British forces, were trained to work at that time. Now the Americans' guns, the guns that the Americans were using came from a few different places, one of 2 national armories, the Springfield Armory in Massachusetts or the Harper's Ferry Armory in Virginia. Both armories had been making the first pattern U.S. standard shoulder arm of the United States military in their history, called the Springfield or the Harper's Ferry model of 1795. It was basically an exact copy of the French Charleville musket that we had used during the American Revolution, that we had imported and were given thousands of these muskets by the French to use during our own War of Independence. And what's the most sincerest form of flattery is imitation. We just basically took the gun to Springfield and said, copy it. And that's exactly what they did. It was a 69 caliber smoothbore musket. And what we mean by those 2 terms, smoothbore and musket, is that the smoothbore means what's on the inside of the barrel. It's basically a pipe. You could just run your finger around the inside and feel nothing but flat as glass in there. The musket is connotates the fact that it is an infantry weapon of the long pattern instead of a carbine, which would be considered shorter, and it's a muzzle loader. So the Springfield muskets of our infantry were 69 caliber, muzzle loading, smooth bore guns. We also had some rifling. We talked about in a couple of the myths that Dr. Wedeman spoke of in two talks before mine, about the myth of the rifleman and the Kentucky rifles and the sheet that we had out front here. For well he knew what aim we'd take with our Kentucky rifles. So he led us down from the cypress swamp. The ground was low, and so on and so on. Anyway, he's talking about the accuracy of the Kentucky rifles. The Americans did have a good number of rifles at the battle. There were a number of complete regiments called Tennessee Riflemen, Kentucky Riflemen. There was even a unit from New Orleans itself of riflemen. They were about the only riflemen that were actually armed with rifles. Now, what is a rifle and how does that differ from a musket? How many of you have watched any of the 26 James Bond films that have been out since 1962? If you remember in the opening sequence of every single James Bond film, you see what you're looking down is the barrel of a pistol. And what you see in that pistol is a series of spiraling lands and grooves. That's rifling. Rifling is basically when a football player takes a football and puts a good spin on it, a good spiral, and he's able to connect with the wide receiver down in the end zone. That never happens in Washington, D.C., but I hear here in New Orleans it actually might take place once in a while. But a good throw with a spiral, you're getting that oblong-shaped pigskin to spin as it goes through the air. And that's what rifling does. You've taken a lead ball, you've wrapped it in a piece of greased cloth or linen, and you force it down a barrel that has these lands and grooves that spiral all the way to the breech. So you're basically threading a projectile into the barrel, so that when you pull the trigger and the frizzen pen goes off, and then the powder goes off in the breech, and that escaping mass of gas starts to push that bullet down the barrel. It's actually pushing that patch, that piece of linen or cloth, down, and it's got a tight grip on that bullet. And as it goes down, it comes out spinning. And that's the difference between a smooth bore and a rifle. It's whether you lob the ball at somebody, just underhanded, or whether you put a good spin on it. It allows you to decrease the diameter of the projectile because you're getting it to go in a more specified direction. You're putting a lot more pressure behind it because there's no escaping gas going around the projectile as it goes down the barrel. And you've added a great deal of accuracy and range to it by using a rifle. Problem is at the Battle of New Orleans, even though there were a lot of units that said they were riflemen, they didn't come with rifles. They showed up, 400 Kentucky riflemen showed up without any guns whatsoever. It had to be armed with some of them Spanish Nicolets, like the one the gentleman in the hallway is demonstrating over the course of the weekend. There was a unit from New Orleans. In fact, the only rifle that anybody has been able to trace to the actual battle here with provenance or chain of custody from that day to this was a rifle carried by one of the New Orleans riflemen named William Bass. And that gun wasn't a Kentucky rifle. It wasn't a Pennsylvania rifle like you hear about them. It was a Virginia rifle. It was made by a guy named John Sheets, about an hour away from where I live in Arlington, Virginia. Sheets was a very well-known rifle maker and had relatives on both sides of the Mason-Dixon line at that point in time, Pennsylvania, Maryland, and Virginia, making rifles. The British also had rifles. They had what was called the Baker rifle, which was not their very first attempt at coming up with a rifle for combat, but certainly the one that kind of laid the foundation for their subsequent rifles. During the American Revolution, you may have heard stories of Major Patrick Ferguson and his breech-loading rifle that he used at the Battle of Monmouth in Brandywine, where he almost shot George Washington, but thought it was ungentlemanly to do so with his back turned. But his rifle was capable of hitting a target the size of a pie plate at 300 yards. A musket of the time period, well, let me have a British major tell you exactly what he thought of the Brown Bess, the British soldier's musket. Again, very similar to ours, much larger in caliber, 75 caliber compared to our 69. And by caliber, I mean thousandths of an inch. So 75 caliber means 3/4 of an inch in diameter of lead. Our guns were a little bit smaller. That meant that they were a lot lighter, a little bit easier to use. Some would say more accurate because we're not pushing such a large lump of lead down range. But Major George Hanger, during the American Revolution, wrote, "A soldier's musket, if not exceedingly ill-bored, will strike the figure of a man at 80 yards. It may even hit it at 100, but a soldier must be very unfortunate indeed who shall be wounded at 150 yards, provided his antagonist actually aimed at him. I maintain that no man was ever killed at 200 yards by a common soldier's musket by anyone who had actually aimed at that individual." 200 yards. He said, now, to be honest, a musket ball will carry 500 to 800 yards before you can literally knock it out of the sky with your hand and not hurt yourself. But at 200 yards, you're still going to walk away either bloodied or with a broken arm or clavicle or whatnot. You just weren't the guy that hit you was actually aiming at when that occurred. And this all comes under what we call that's to say my time is up. Will you give me a few more minutes?
Sure.
Thank you. That's to say that the riflemen that we had on the American side basically concentrated their fire at the very far right of the American line. And Dr. Wedeman's one of the contributors to this excellent book, which I'm putting in a shameless plug for. It's for sale out front. But it has a wonderful chapter on the very subject I'm going over with you right now. That fire was on the extreme American right and did a great deal to disrupt and to basically flatten the British advance on that artillery redoubt and to maintain the integrity of our right flank. What about the 2,000 other casualties that were there? Were the riflemen of legend from Tennessee and Kentucky really that effective? Most historians would say they weren't. For one reason is because there just weren't that many of them. Some would estimate at most a quarter of Jackson's men may have had rifles, but there's really, on paper, that's the only evidence that we have of that many individuals. The number comes closer to probably about 300 total may have been armed with rifles. A rifle will carry and kill an individual. These guys were trained to do so at 300 and 400 yards. General Pakenham, although most historians will say he was killed by a canister or grape, which is the best that I'm able to understand, that came from an artillery piece. But he was felled. He was knocked off his horse. He had his hand pierced and shattered by a rifle ball at 400 yards. Somebody shot him off his horse at 400 yards from the American redoubt. The number of British killed by rifles may or may never obviously be known to us, but one of the things we want to take into account is the fact that to be an effective rifleman, you have to be able to see your target. And in that morning mist, they said it was impossible to see very far down the field. So could they have begun to inflict the targets on the British infantry from the great distances that they were capable of if they couldn't even see them that morning? Most of the casualties, I understand, were much closer to the ramparts. That gives you an idea that it was basically not the rifle, not the musket, not the pistol or the saber or the bayonet that turned the day, but it was those 8 batteries of artillery that Jackson had. You saw the illustrations earlier of canister and grape. It was those 32-pound guns that could fire as many as 200 musket balls in one shot. 200 musket balls in one shot to clear a gigantic opening in the British line that did the most damage, that paid the butcher's bill that morning, was the artillery. Now, even though the British had an entire regiment of riflemen, some 350 members of the 95th, made famous by the Sharp series, these were guys that went straight from New Orleans to Europe to fight Napoleon. One of the guys wrote after the Battle of Waterloo about the American marksmen at New Orleans. He had served both at Waterloo later that year and then at New Orleans earlier. He said, an American marksman will see a red squirrel and hit it at 200 yards where a British soldier won't even be able to identify an elephant at 200 yards. And he's talking about his own colleagues. Another time he says, and the Imperial Palace Guard of Napoleon, an entire brigade of that guard couldn't hit a church at 400 yards. How ineffective their cavalry carbines, their short-barreled muskets were at that time. So what really did the day's work? Was it the rifles? No, I don't think so. There weren't that many of them, and they really didn't have the ability to reach out and touch somebody at the great distances that they're most effective. Was it the muskets? Certainly we had well-trained and well-disciplined regulars and volunteers and militia on the line. And they, on this side of the river, they stuck to their ramparts and were able to deliver a devastating fire to the enemy, for sure. But I believe it was the 8 batteries of artillery that did most of the work. Now, we all say that there's no sense in reinventing the wheel. After every conflict, we go forth and try to write a lessons learned program from what we had just encountered. Did the British do that in January of 1815? No. 101 years later, on the 1st of July, 1916, the British Army would line up an entire corps in front of German trenches along the River Somme in France. You think 2008 was a bad ratio? They would lose 60,000 men before lunch. 60,000 men before lunch on one side, going up against triangulated fields of defensive fire with Maxim water-fed 8mm fully automatic belt-fed machine guns. 60,000 men in one morning. So lessons learned, we have to keep relearning them. We need to advance, evolve in what we're doing to be able to overcome. So I apologize for going over my time limit, and if anybody has any questions, I'll be happy to answer them after back to the room.
Yeah, we have time for a question or two if anybody has one.
Sir.
I'm curious about Eli Whitney's gunworks. I mean, that was established with Jefferson's benefit in 1798. Why were they still using guns from Springfield?
Well, we were using guns from wherever we could get them. We also had a pattern 1792 rifle that was being made by contractors like Sheets, like Diefenbaugh, by Schreier, all over the country at that point. We're making contract rifles. It's the rifle that we think that Lewis and Clark took with them, and not the Harper's Ferry rifle of 1803. So it's just a matter of trying to get enough of them made. You can't rely on one armory to produce, even at 3 shifts. We had to contract out, outsource the work to get more of them in the inventory.